Hey, Katie. We have the clue in the diary. We are on chapter 9, A Scare. Eagerly, Nancy tore open the envelope and unfolded the sheet inside. A bill for the repairs to my car, she told Hannah Gruen. It sounds very fair. Mr. Baylor Weston, who ran into me, shouldn't mind paying this amount. The housekeeper laughed. The garage mechanic was certainly prompt in delivering his bill. I asked him to be, Nancy defended the man. I want to present this bill in the Mapleton garage one right away to Mr. Weston. That's the spirit, came a voice from the doorway. Good morning. Mr. Drew walked in, kissed Nancy, and asked, How are you, Hannah? Carson Drew took his place at the head of the table, then said, Nancy, I learned yesterday that Baylor Weston owns an electronics factory in Stanford. What a break for me, Nancy exclaimed. I can do 2 errands at once. She told about having seen the name of the Stanford Electrics Company in the diary and her intention of finding out if Mr. Swenson worked there. Excellent idea, said Mr. Drew. And now for more news. You found Mr. Raybould? Nancy asked eagerly. Yes and no. To be strictly correct, I found Mrs. Raybould. Where is she, Dad? At a summer resort on Lake Mentor. I talked with Mrs. Raybould on the phone. She became very upset about the fire and told me she would return today to look into the matter. And her husband? She didn't say where he is and was rather evasive when I questioned her about him. I'd like to talk to Mrs. Raybould, Dad. Well, why don't you? She'll surely stay at the Maplecroft Inn because it's the only hotel within 3 miles of the Raybould estate. My guess is that if you go there for luncheon, you might meet her. That's a grand idea, Nancy said excitedly. I see now why you're called River Heights' leading lawyer. She asked her father if he knew of someone who could translate the diary. I've already checked, Mr. Drew replied, but my 2 friends who speak Swedish are away on vacation. Nancy was so enthusiastic about the idea of visiting the inn that as soon as she had finished breakfast, she phoned Bess and George. Always eager for adventure, they quickly said they would love to go along. By 11 o'clock, the 3 girls were en route. I have a feeling we're about to learn something important, Nancy confided to her friends. It was only a few minutes after 12 when the girls reached the pleasant little inn. Nancy parked beside a row of cars at the rear of the building. The girls went inside and inquired for Mrs. Raybould. She hasn't arrived yet, the desk clerk said, but we expect her any minute. The girls strolled outside and sat down on the porch. But after an hour had elapsed, the wealthy woman still had not arrived. Bess gave a huge sigh. I'm starved. We may as well have luncheon. I don't believe Mrs. Raybould is coming. Looks that way, Nancy admitted in disappointment. Wait a second, though. Here comes another car. Hopefully, the girls watched as a large automobile swept up the driveway. A chauffeur assisted a frail, nervous-looking woman of middle age to alight. She clung unsteadily to his arm, and for a moment the girls thought she would faint. The chauffeur said encouragingly, You'll feel better, Mrs. Raybould, after you've had your lunch. So this was Mrs. Raybould. She made no response other than to give a low moan. Still leaning on the chauffeur's arm, she walked uncertainly up the porch steps. Goodness, Bess exclaimed in a whisper. Isn't that poor woman pale? She looks ill. I'm surprised her husband left her alone. Nancy did not comment. She was watching Mrs. Raybould closely, and it struck her that the woman was actually ill. As she reached the porch, Mrs. Raybould caught hold of a post for support. I can't go on, she whispered weakly. Then she fainted. The chauffeur caught her in his arms as she fell and eased her to the level of the porch. Nancy and her friends, thoroughly alarmed, rushed forward to be of assistance. I'll get her some water, Nancy cried, and dashed inside. The desk clerk came rushing out. Take her to the manager's office, he suggested kindly. I'll call a doctor. The chauffeur quickly explained that they had just been to the scene of the fire. Then Mrs. Raybould was carried inside and made comfortable on the couch. Her face was pale, but as Nancy applied a wet cloth to her forehead, she revived somewhat. Felix, she moaned. Oh, Felix! Your husband will be here soon, Nancy assured her soothingly. Her words had an astounding effect upon the woman. She half raised herself, and her eyes, fluttering open, had a wild expression in them. My husband is dead, she moaned. He burned to death. She must be hysterical, said the manager's secretary. I hope the doctor gets here soon. Your husband isn't dead, Nancy said soothingly. Mrs. Raybolt appeared not to hear the girl, for she went on wildly. He burned to death in the fire. Oh, Felix! What's she talking about? Demanded the manager, who had just entered the room. I'm sure her husband wasn't in the house at the time it burned, said Nancy. The investigators found no evidence of anyone having been trapped inside. Yet, as she spoke, doubt besieged Nancy. How did she know that Felix Raybolt had not been trapped inside the house? True, no body had been found, but what if the explosion... Nancy put the horrible thought out of her mind. Mrs. Raybolt revived sufficiently to sit up, and, after she had drunk the glass of water Nancy had handed her, she appeared to be less agitated. You must be mistaken about your husband, Bess told her gently. No, no, the woman cried. He went there the night of the fire to see a man on business. I had a feeling he shouldn't go, and I tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen to me. I haven't heard from Felix since that night. Mrs. Raybolt broke down and sobbed hysterically. Nancy asked the name of the man who Felix Raybolt had gone to see. I don't know, she replied. Felix never confided any business matters to me. He resented questions. I do know that Felix was uneasy about the appointment. Why? He anticipated possible physical violence. Nancy and her friends gulped. If the person with whom Mr. Raybolt had an appointment was Joe Swenson, here was still another count against the Swedish inventor. At that moment the doctor appeared. He briskly cleared the room, insisting that the patient have absolute quiet. Nancy and her friends left with the others. Well, what do you think of the case now? George whispered tensely. I think, Nancy returned soberly, that things look very black for poor Joe Swenson. The three girls ate luncheon in silence. They did not want to discuss the mystery in public, and were too concerned to talk of anything else. When they finished eating, Nancy stopped at the reservation desk and asked the clerk for directions to Stanford. Take the shortcut across Sunview Mountain, he advised. It's half the distance it would be by the main road. Nancy thanked him, and the girls went to the car. As they were about to drive off, a state trooper stopped Nancy and said, A word of advice, young ladies. We believe a dangerous criminal is hiding in the vicinity. Keep your doors locked. What did he do? Bess asked fearfully. It's suspected he's a firebug, robber, and, well, he may use a gun on anyone who gets in his way. What's his name? Nancy inquired, her heart sinking in the fear that it would be Joe Swenson. To her relief, the officer replied that the police were still working to establish the man's identity. But watch your step, and if you should see anything suspicious, be sure to report it to us. I will, Nancy promised, and drove off. 5 miles farther on, she turned into the narrow shortcut across Sunview Mountain. The twisting road, bordered by tangled undergrowth and dense woods, was deserted. Bess shivered. The wildest section in the county, she exclaimed nervously. Just the sort of place a criminal would choose for a hideout. For goodness sakes, Nancy, step on the gas. This is a spooky road, George murmured presently. Wouldn't it be funny if we should come upon Joe Swenson peering out at us from the bushes? Funny? Bess demanded. I'd be frightened out of my wits. Wouldn't you, Nancy? Well, I don't know, the other replied truthfully. I'm eager to find that man. So am I, Bess replied, but I'd rather not run into any stranger in this out-of-the-way spot. Nancy did not reply immediately, and her friends noticed that she appeared to be scanning the woods searchingly. You think the criminal might actually be hiding along this road? Bess demanded anxiously. Nancy nodded. It's possible. Turn back, Bess pleaded. No telling what he might do to us. Don't get jittery, Nancy advised. Remember, we have to find out if Joe Swenson works at the plant in Stanford. As they drove along the winding road, the three girls maintained a vigilant lookout. Suddenly, Bess cried out, There's a man ahead at the side of the road. He's motioning at us to stop. Don't do it, Nancy. Ooh, I'll find out who this man is.